During the dark days of the Raj, many predicted that the idea of India would eventually fail and the divisions of caste, religion, and race would come to define the subcontinent. The 75 years of independent India have proved these doomsayers utterly wrong. Instead of the divisions, the peaceful coexistence of its various ethnic and cultural groups has come to define the Indian nation. Hence, it is naturally a matter of grave concern that much of the national and international media, in their coverage of India, have been featuring alarming headlines about the rise of intolerance. Gruesome stories about communal violence and mob lynchings appear to have become commonplace. Many of India's prominent artists and academics, along with veteran bureaucrats and opposition politicians, have felt compelled to draft public letters, deliver emotional parliamentary speeches, and file writ petitions in the Supreme Court seeking urgent action to check this disturbing trend. Even foreign leaders such as Barack Obama and Kamala Harris have pushed diplomatic boundaries to remind India of its commitment to democracy and the strength it derives from being inclusive. Can all of this be simply an overreaction, or is it a sinister conspiracy to defame India? Or worse, is it true? Is India actually witnessing a rise in hate? If indeed true, it raises several important questions. What is driving this hate? Was it always there and is just manifesting itself? Or is it a new kind of virus rapidly spreading through our society? Finally, can it be stopped? And if not, where are we headed? To address these questions, we are honored to have with us Harsh Mander. Mr. Mander is a former bureaucrat, social activist, and award-winning author. He has been described as the conscious keeper of the nation. In 2017, he started the internationally acclaimed campaign Karwan-e-Mohabbat in solidarity with the victims of mob lynchings and religiously motivated violence. This year, the Peace Research Institute Oslo has shortlisted him and his campaign for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. Hello and welcome to Argumentative Indians. I am Yajur Arora, your host today, and I have the privilege to be face-to-face in conversation with Mr. Harsh Mander. Harsh, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Yajur. It's a pleasure for me to be with you, and I hope with your predominantly young listeners and viewers who I think must reflect on what I think is perhaps the most important and difficult question facing India today. Let me get started. I am quite convinced as I look around that India finds itself today in a frighteningly dark and violent space of fear and hate. It is a particularly frightening place to live in if you're a member of a minority community, especially if you're a Muslim, also if you're Dalit, and in some parts of the country, if you're Christian. India wasn't always this way. Young people need to be mindful how far we have strayed from the country that was once imagined and promised in our freedom struggle led by Mahatma Gandhi and the India written into the constitution led by Baba Sahib Ambedkar. It's a part of our history that is rapidly getting lost. And I think those final years leading up to our independence and in fact the months that followed, culminating in Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, in some ways the most defining period in the birth of our nation, and the golden period in Mahatma Gandhi's life and contributions. Not too many young people would be able to answer what led to the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi just months after India won its freedom. For that, you'll have to go back to 1947. India was torn apart. Rivers of blood were flowing on both sides of the border. Hindus and Muslims, Sikhs were slaughtering each other. 1 million people died in that violence. Pakistan was constituted on the basis of religious identity as a separate nation. About an estimated 14 million people were displaced from their homes, including, incidentally, my own family who were in what is now Rawalpindi in Pakistan. And this was the largest distress displacement in human history that we saw in partition. Now, in such a time when train loads of people in both directions, train loads were coming with everybody slaughtered. At a time like this, when anger, when hate was rising to climatic levels, in a sense, I think it's the enormous good fortune of our country that we were led by someone like Mahatma Gandhi. And just to underline the distance that we have traveled and to where we are, let me talk about a little bit about his last months and why he got assassinated. When India was celebrating its freedom, 15th August 47, Gandhiji was not in Delhi. He was in Calcutta, where communal violence had reached, was just not ending. And after some days, he announced that he would go on a fast until the last bit of violence ended. And it's an extraordinary time when Lord Mountbatten later said that what my 55,000 armed soldiers could not do in Punjab, this one man, frail old man with just his body and moral courage, was able to stop. All violence came to an end. A beautiful story is told about this fast. Many are told, but a Hindu man was very angry, and he went up to Gandhiji and said, what you're doing is very wrong. I had a child this small whose parents were killed by Muslim mobs. How can I overcome my hate and anger? And Gandhiji's reply was that I understand your pain, but if you really want to, overcome that pain and hate, let me tell you a way. Find a Muslim child this small, whose parents have been killed by Hindu mobs, and adopt that child, raise him like your own son, but raise him in his own faith, and maybe you will find a way to heal. These are kinds of conversations that young people today do not hear. We are continuously led by our political leaders, often our own parents, our families, our WhatsApp groups. We are encouraged to hate. And Gandhiji then came to Delhi, where there was enormous violence. And the question, if Pakistan has been constituted for Muslims, India should be a Hindu nation. His insistence and that of his closest allies, Nehru, Patel, Maulana Azad, was that India would be a country that belongs equally to people of every faith, every identity, every caste. It would not matter which God you worship. If you worship no God, you would be a fully equal member of this community. That was the core of the promise. And it was this pledge, and I don't have time to talk more about the last fast that he had in Delhi just 2 weeks before he was assassinated. Refugees who had come from Pakistan were so angry that they had occupied many mosques and dargahs, the Connaught Place Mosque, the dargah in Mehroli. They had turned out, and Gandhi's demand in his fast was that we must restore with respect the mosques and dargahs. There can be no true place of worship built on hatred and violence against another community. What his views on the Ram temple in Ayodhya would be is very clear. And likewise, people had driven out Muslims from their homes and occupied the occupied their homes. His demand was that we must call our Muslim brothers and sisters back, give them back their homes, and you go back to the refugee camps, even to make a demand of that kind. And his, 1 lakh people came out in support of his demands by the 5th day of his fast. All his demands were accepted. 2 weeks later, he was assassinated. It was this very idea of equal citizenship that was written into our constitution, led by a person who was probably the most learned and competent person, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, but also one who had directly suffered the consequences of caste injustice. And so what is the Constitution? It is at the same time a solemn set of pledges, the imagination of a country we would build together, the terms of the new social contract that we the people would build together in this new land. India would be humane, it was promised, it would be inclusive, it would assure equal citizenship in every way for people of every faith, caste, gender, language, culture, ethnicity. The Constitution, spoke of 4 pillars: justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. If I use Hindustani, what this really meant: insaf, sabke liye insaf, azadi, liberty, सरकार से विरोध करने की आज़ादी, अपने मजहब की आज़ादी, आप पगड़ी पहनना चाहते हैं या हिजाब पहनना चाहते हैं उसकी आज़ादी, डर से आज़ादी, भूख से आज़ादी, and equality, समानता, बराबरी, and fraternity, which I think is the least understood. Fraternity, the Hindi word is bandhuta, from Sanskrit, कि हम एक दूसरे से बंधे हुए हैं. Our destinies are tied to each other. We might be in different religions, different identities, but we are tied to each. Pain meted out when Pehlu Khan is beaten on his back by a mob. I feel the pain on my back. That is bandhuta. So these were the pillars of our constitution. India's situation today, and for me a tragedy, is that people steeped deeply, lifelong, in the ideology, the Hindu supremacist ideology that spurred Gandhiji's killing, are in fact ruling India today. The Hindutva project stands for a radically different imagination for India. It rejects the idea of equal citizenship. It requires at its core a radical, violent rupture between India's Hindus and those of the hated other that it constructs, India's Muslims and Christians. For the young people who are watching here, people stand in different perspectives. I'm not one to say what is right and wrong, but be clear about what choices you're making. Do you want to grow old in a country where everybody lives as equal citizens with love and mutual respect, We respect each other's diversity, different views, different ways of worship. You can look different, you can eat differently, you can talk a different language, you can love differently. People of different sexuality. But we are still brothers and sisters in this beautiful land. That's one way of looking at it. And another is that no, this land belongs to its caste Hindus. It is their land. And here, if Muslims and Christians, also Dalits, want to live here, we will allow them. We will allow them, but only as second-class citizens, inferior, always subordinate to the Hindu majority without rights. So this is a country, this is an alternative imagination for India, which is built on unequal citizenship and consequent inequality in your rights, and carried to further extremes of hate and fear. Looking around at India today, a recent report, a very respected organization called Genocide Watch, listed India as the country with the second highest chance of slipping into a genocide in the world. I'm not, this required far more attention. That this is a report that has predicted earlier genocides, including in Rwanda. Genocide is a project of mass extermination of a people of an identity which is hated. The report says that early signs are there in our beloved India of such a possible violent catastrophe. It doesn't say that a genocide is going to happen, but it says that early signs of, when you compare, I am spending a few months in Germany studying precisely what happened here. How did the Holocaust finally occur? And in those years of the 1930s, before the Holocaust and the World War, there's so many parallels to what we are seeing today in India. And it is those early signs. Interfaith marriages are criminalized. Citizenship has to be proved by histories, economic boycott, segregation, political segregation, and so on and so forth. So let me speak a little bit about these worrying early signs. Firstly, hate speech. There's a stunning rise in toxic hate speech. And again, you asked, is it, I spent a child, I was born 8 years after independence, and I grew up in a childhood, although we were a partition family, I do not recall a single time when I heard anything of prejudice and hate from my parents, in my school. It was a far more idealistic time, and from our leaders. Today, we're seeing a stunning rise in what NDTV has tracked what it calls VIP hate speech. This is hate speech by senior leaders of government or political parties. And it finds, since Mr. Modi came to power in 2014, a 1,130% increase in hate speech compared to the previous regime. Led sometimes by the Prime Minister himself, much more shrilly by his Home Minister, several Union and Chief Ministers. What does this hate speech do? It stigmatizes, taunts, insults, sometimes openly incites violence against India's Muslims. Taunts and dog whistles like those who say Abba Jan, those who can be recognized by their clothes, claims that earlier governments were not, and I was just hearing a speech by the UP Chief Minister, and he said, we have done welfare work. The earlier government spent all its money and resources to build the walls of Qabristans. I mean, it is shocking to hear this kind of, and of course, the Home Minister speaks of termites. And we must remember that in Rwanda, again, before violence broke out in large, similar kind of reference to the hated other as cockroaches and so on and so forth. These speeches falsely construct and depict Muslims as bigoted, violent oppressors of Hindus in history, as breakers of Hindu temples, and in contemporary times as infiltrators, unpatriotic, loyal to Pakistan, terrorists, sexual predators, love jihadis, cow killers, child breeders, infiltrators. And Christians are, portrayed as, people who get huge amounts of foreign donations, and they use this. I mean, they do provide humanitarian services, but these are primarily a bribe for tribal and other impoverished people to bribe them into conversion. And even Mother Teresa is not exempt from this kind of hate construction, as we recently saw. But it's not just VIPs. Online and in public gatherings, a range of other extreme right-wing supporters, from people in saffron robes, as in the Hardwar Dharm Sansad, jobless youth to upmarket tech doyens. I'm even more candid in spouting their hate. They openly call for boycotts, expulsion, mass killing, genocides, mass rape. Sometimes, for the official record, a thin official line is sometimes drawn. These are fringe elements. But these claim wears thin because they are rarely punished. They get bail quickly if at all they are arrested. Many are inducted into party positions. And even the Prime Minister follows some of the most poisonous hate super spreaders on Twitter. In Germany, often people have told me the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with hate speech. The other signs of dread is actual violence. Brutal lynching, which is early reminiscent of the lynchings in America from the late 19th century, right up to about 1950, 1960, have increasingly become routine. Mobs surround and brutally kill Muslims, sometimes Dalit men, on unproved charges of cow slaughter. All of this is videotaped, gleefully circulated widely on social media, consumed by millions. In 2017, as you were saying, Yajur, I was deeply anguished by the silence of the large majority as this happened. It was as if it's not something that we need to be worried about. And it was really to break this silence. And the silence again reminded me so much of Germany in the 1930s, where people watched all of this happening as the years passed and did nothing about it. So in order to break the silence, I said that I've made a promise that we will set out and we'll go to every home of any person anywhere in the country who has suffered from hate violence. To do four things. The first of them is to say, you're not alone. There are many people who care and stand with you in your pain. We seek forgiveness for what we have become as a people. We will stand with you as you battle to rebuild your life and fight for justice. And we will ensure that your story is told. So that is another part of, sorry, just excuse me. Yeah, so that's another part of the story. That's what we tried to do. We made about 30 journeys, very painful journeys. And we saw there was so much cruelty in the hatred of each of these lynchings that families started saying, काश वो बस गोली मार देते, छुरा मार देते, इतना torture करके क्यों उन्होंने मारा? Why did they gouge out their eyes? They smash their genitals. This is really a reality and a huge reality. From reported cases, 86% of people killed in these lynchings were of Muslim identity, 8% were of Dalit identity, and the number of these kinds of mass lynchings was, I think 96% of it was basically happened after the government changed. The reason for it is a certain enabling environment where hatred has become legitimized, normalized. It is all over us. If our leaders, if our families, if the media, all of them normalize, legitimize, valorize hatred, this is where we will reach. There are other instances as well. A child is beaten for drinking water in a temple, a youth for daring to sell bangles to a Hindu girl, another for selling meat. But increasingly, people are being thrashed only for being visibly Muslim or for operating Christian places of worship. And then there's state actions. There's a political project, where the ruling party, although Muslims are, 200 million people in this country, equal citizens under the constitution, they don't have a single Muslim MP. Then, there's, of course, the actions in Kashmir, the only Muslim majority state that we had, now downgraded, is among the most militarized regions of the world. The Citizenship Amendment Act, which for the first time differentiated on the basis of religious identity, undocumented people of Muslim faith had lesser rights to access citizenship. We saw what happened in Assam. I myself saw the detention centers where people were locked up indefinitely because they didn't have documents. The comparisons with what happened in Myanmar are there for us to see, where the Rohingya were first declared non-citizens, and then as stateless non-citizens, then we saw what happened. Also, nightmarish is frightening echoes of the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany. Many governments are passing love jihad laws that enable the police to criminalize Muslim men who consensually marry Hindu women. In the run-up to the elections in Uttar Pradesh, the BJP manifesto promises jail sentences of 10 years for so-called love jihad. Two adults of different religions have decided to marry, to be together. And this has become a dangerously criminal act. Also, large numbers are imprisoned in this state, even under national security laws, for allegedly trading in beef. This never is explained why this, even if you're trading in beef, how this violates the country's security. There's the rewriting of history, the changes in city names and roads, trying to, eliminate a huge part of our history. My greatest worry is, of course, the large popular support for many of these hate projects. So in Gurgaon, which is the city with the highest per capita income in this country, there was huge expansion of population. Migrants came in large numbers. There were only 2 mosques, which were okay for the old Gurgaon. Now in Gurugram, there's just no place for people to do their Friday prayers. So they would assemble in parks and so on Friday. Suddenly this became an issue 2-3 years ago. There was a lot of action against this namaz, finally, they negotiated and came down to 30 sites. Now, in the last 2 or 3 months, suddenly people have got very agitated, and even these 30 sites are being, people want to suddenly land up there and start raising slogans or Jai Shri Ram or throw cow dung. But I saw a picture of a group of young boys very pleased with themselves, saying they came to play cricket on Friday afternoons in the place where namaz is done. We have to play cricket. The whole dispute which is going on about girls wearing hijabs in coastal Karnataka to class. Suddenly we have this huge number of young people wearing, identical saffron scarves. This kind of division that is being manufactured between our people and young people are taking sides. It causes me deep worry, but there are also signs of hope. In all of these, in Gurgaon itself, the Gurdwaras opened up and said, what is the problem? You come and pray in the Gurdwaras. There were Hindu men who opened up their homes, their garages, their factories. And in Karnataka, we see again another group of young people who are coming out in defense of the right of the girls to dress the way that they choose to dress. The anti-CA protests, in fact, was the largest democratic movement based on Hindu-Muslim unity all across the country. For those 100 days, I was invited to far corners, and it was really heartening because the Constitution, the national flag, became the icons of this struggle. People used to gather of both Muslim, Hindu, Christian, Sikh identities together, read the Constitution preamble. The only flag you would see is the national flag, and we showed that you might try to divide us. One of the posters was "You divide, we multiply." So that it was also the time of hope. You said in your introductory paragraphs that it is tempting for supporters of the ruling establishment to dismiss all of this as alarmist, mischievous, motivated foreign interference. I see them as an attempt to alert the national conscience. The Holocaust Museum, Memorial Museum report also says if we are in denial, we know from the Holocaust what can happen when early warning signs go unheeded. I repeat, what is at stake in this country for young people who are listening to me is just the question, what kind of country do you want to grow old in? What kind of country do you want to leave for your children? This is what we are deciding. You want one kind of country that was promised in our freedom struggle, a kind and inclusive country, then we have to fight for it with love, but with courage as well, in the way that Gandhi showed us. But if you believe that you want another country which is founded on unequal citizenship and ultimately on hate and fear, be clear that is what you want. And yes, we all have to make our choices. I'm in Germany trying to learn from the German people how they confronted their horrific Nazi past. A pastor called Schormöller Lemmer spoke to a philosopher, Susan Neimer, when she asked, what can we learn from Germany? He replied, and I end with this, he said, you can learn that no country, no culture, no religion is immune to falling into the abyss into which we fell in Germany. And once it begins, there will always be people who shut down their conscience and side with the strong man? Can we recognize that our leaders have taken India to the very edge of this abyss? My desperate hope is only that enough of us in India and around the world don't shut down our conscience. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So now everybody who's watching us on Zoom or on YouTube, please feel free to ask questions, put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll bring them into the conversation, as well as we'll bring you in the conversation. I wanted to take a step back and ask you a sort of like a very, let's say, primary question on this, that India has had a very long history of religious strife going back centuries. Is it possible that the few episodes of unity that emerged during the freedom struggle, especially like you mentioned under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, they were an aberration, and this religious hate is the norm of Indian society?
Yeah, that's a powerful and important question. I believe quite the opposite. I believe that each of us contain within ourselves our best selves and our worst selves. And I think the greatness of the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi and others in our freedom struggle was that they drew out from us our best selves. I think today we have leaders, in my opinion, who are drawing out from us our worst selves. Now, it's not that our leaders are creating hate. The hate is within us. You're absolutely right. But I still believe and hope, and I'm not saying this in the air. As a civil servant, I've handled major communal riots during the Babri Masjid period, during the 84 riots. I quit the IAS in protest against the Gujarat 2002 massacre. And since then, I have been working with victims of communal violence, and I've also studied and written. And I am absolutely convinced that the danger, as I just quoted as well, none of us are ever exempt from falling into this abyss of hate and fear. But I don't think that is where, left to ourselves, is where we would go. And what is extraordinary about India is that, different from Trump in the US. In the US, if you're white American, there's a greater chance that you would be voting Trump. But if you're a white American with a university degree, there's a much lesser chance. In India, it's strangely absolutely the reverse. The strongest proponents of hate and division are actually the people who've had the greatest privilege, the most privileged education, the most privileged life opportunities. Whereas I have found in working class poor people, left to themselves, I feel are very much more comfortable with living with diversity. It's not unusual to go to a poor person's house in a village to find there'll be a picture of Jesus Christ somewhere, there'll be a picture of Makkah, Medina somewhere, there'll be a picture of Krishna and Ram at another place. They would not have any problem with, they're passing a church or a dargah, they will also bow their head, they'll bow their head in a temple. That is, if there's something wonderful about our civilization, it is this idea of equal respect for every faith. And I think that is what truly defines us, not this hatred and fear and stigma.
Why do you think that educated people in India are so amenable to condoning injustices to their fellow countrymen or incidents of hate? You mentioned a few, like the Gurgaon, where people have been prevented from being able to pray. And Gurgaon is a rather wealthy and educated area. I have to remark, it's one of the most
highest per capita income in the country, the city with the highest.
Exactly. So what brings this apathy and indifference among the educated people in India, which we don't see in other places? I want to link also Germany with this, because that's a parallel we saw in Germany, where the educated people remained indifferent to what was going on to Jews during the Holocaust.
Yeah, in fact, not just indifferent. I mean, Germany, the parallels are so strong. I'm studying it deeply. I'll be coming back and write a book which actually compares our two situations. Our situations are interesting because Germany in the 40s was Nazi Germany, and where 6 million Jews had been exterminated. And we were being led by leaders like Mahatma Gandhi. And today you find a much more, I mean, the German people have really struggled against this policy of hate and anti-Semitism. Their memorials, where would you have a place where there are memorials to the crimes that they committed? And those are the main memorials. There's no military displays. Nobody, they're very careful that, we can't go down. Nationalism, love for your country, it isn't meant, isn't ruled by how much hatred you have for other countries. It's by what you do for your people in quiet ways, etc. So, but in Germany, the universities were hotbeds of anti-Semitism at that time. Germany is an interesting country that till actually Hitler, Germany was the country in the world which produced the largest number of Nobel Prize winners, for instance. And a lot of this got destroyed in this tempest of hate that they created, and they're still trying to rebuild themselves. So I worry about why people of education and privilege and wealth are so much more amenable to hatred against minorities. It's even more worrying because in the United States, I don't know if you know, the community which is the wealthiest community in the United States today, even more than the white community, is the Indian community. The kind of wealth that they have on the one hand, and the huge support that they have for the politics of the RSS and the BJP was visible to all of us. Now, the interesting thing is that in the US, they want all the protections of a minority. But in their own countries of origin, they want to snatch away whatever small responsibilities that a democracy at least has to its minorities. So I think that, and our family WhatsApp groups, etc. I mean, I am amazed. After I left the IS in 2002, in a sense, because I took the stand, I realized how people responded to me. And I lost almost 70-80% of people I'd grown up with. People in my childhood, my extended family, people in the IS, etc. And there was a small number which was very strongly with me. But it is true that hatred and bigotry exist within us. But when an environment is created where this becomes legitimate, as I said, there are 3 words that I use. Hatred and bigotry has been normalized. It's normal to speak. As I said, I never heard such conversations. My father was also a senior civil servant. I couldn't dream that people could talk in this way. So it is normalized, then it is legitimized. This is the right thing to do. And then it is valorized. You really love your country only if you can hate. And the more you hate, the more. And here, it's not got anything to do with rational thinking, because the evidence, prejudice, you take prejudice by prejudice. I can have a long conversation with you. Each prejudice you have about the community, this is what the evidence is. But I have had conversations with so many people who say, I don't accept this evidence. You don't accept this evidence? No, I don't accept. And you will stay, despite your education, you'll still stay with your prejudices. In Hindi, there's a proverb that you can, आप सोए को तो जगा सकते हैं, जागे को कैसे जगाएं? You can wake
Absolutely.
up
I think that
hungry.
education makes you more confident and you are less likely to scrutinize your own prejudices. But let me just bring a counter view. You are attributing a lot of this to the ruling party, the BJP and their affiliate, obviously RSS. But just do you
the responsibilities of the other? Yeah, no, I'm not at all blaming only. I mean, I don't think there's any exclusive responsibility of the BJP and the RSS.
Do you entertain the possibility that this, what is happening, was an inevitable outcome of the mass access to internet and social media? Because it's not a trend that's only happening in India. I can't comment on the extent, but we are witnessing such movements in other parts of the world as well. So could it be that it had to happen no matter which party was in the center?
No, yeah, I think that I think the so-called secular parties, the Congress Party and others, have over recent decades lost more and more of the moral conviction of what they actually are supposed to stand for. And this is the party of Gandhi, Nehru, Maulana Azad Sattar Patel. How can it, take many of the positions that it did? And in the whole movement, Ayodhya movement, or even in major communal riots, the position of these parties has been very often betraying the values that they are supposed to stand for. And it is that which has opened up more and more space for. Now, if I'm a person who is convinced that India should be, say, a Hindu nation, that Muslims should be second-class citizens, why should I actually vote for the Congress, which is at best trying to be a B party once in a while, or Aam Aadmi Party, or this one or that one? I'll vote for the people who've actually consistently stood with this ideology they never accepted the constitution. They were opposed to the national flag. They were very clear about where they stood. So I think that but there is still a difference in a party which is betraying its pluralist secular ideology of the constitution, and one whose whole basis of existence is actually this opposition. And it is in the last 7 years that we are seeing a very aggressive hurtling towards this. You wondered whether this is as a result of social media. A lot of people talk about social media and its consequences. I just wanted to say that social media is a very powerful instrument, but it is not inherently an instrument that can only be used for hate. A lot of popular movements, in fact, of resistance and protests, including the anti-CA protests, including the farmers' protests in India, but many others, the Arab Spring and so many others, have happened also using the same internet possibilities. So I think social media has revolutionized communication and popularized it, in a sense, democratized it, but also created very effective avenues for hate. But you listen to partition stories, hate and these same rumors used to spread very fast even there.
Hi, sorry. So I want to push back a little bit on, so right now, what you're claiming is that the opposition has not come out strongly against the othering of minority religions.
Not consistently, not bravely, not moral conviction.
When I look at popular media and the views that are prevalent at the moment, it's a lot of people claim that what's happening right now is a reaction to the other parties having appeased the minority for a very long time. It's their view that for example, that if a Hindutva leader comes out and says something abhorrent, which they do fairly frequently, you do see a reaction from most of the liberal establishment and media condemning it. But the same people tend to be reticent when a religious leader from a minority community were to make an abhorrent statement about women or anything else. So they consider this to be a biased treatment, which has made the liberal or secular parties lose their credibility. So what I'm saying is it's actually the opposite. They think there has been a bias towards the minority communities and the opposition parties, which has led to the popularity of the current government.
If you talk about this whole business about appeasement is a very curious kind of argument, because what it is basically saying is that earlier governments have done too much for the minorities and too much for the Dalits. And we have to set this right. One of the few very statesperson-like things that Dr. Manmohan Singh did was to set up a committee headed by Justice Satchar, where all he said was, let us actually see what is the status of Muslims in India today. And the evidence that came through was that they were now in such a bad position that they were, along with the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, the most disadvantaged in all respects. Now, the point is that if the government had done too much for them, if they'd been appeasing them, then they should have been much better off. So, caste Hindus dominate everything, whether you see business, industry, media houses, editors of various media houses, academia, armed forces, politics. It's all, and yet they are saying we are being disadvantaged. So, and again, the comparison with other parts of the world, this is precisely, in America also, it's precisely the same idea that we are white people, this is our country, and we are being treated with disadvantage in our country. Now, really mirroring this, caste Hindus are saying this is our country and we are being disadvantaged in our country, while we actually dominate every walk of life. So I think it's what I call a moral inversion. We are being persuaded. If there has been any appeasement, in this country, it has been of communal forces. And it has been an appeasement of communal forces of every religious identity. It is true that sometimes political parties are not strong enough or vocal enough when communal statements are made by people of the minority communities, but they are even more scared to actually come out in resistance when communal statements are made by people from the majority community, religious leaders from the majority community. So I think that this myth, and Mr. L.K. Advani had started this myth of appeasement, is really a myth. The Muslim community has not been appeased in India. They are in a very bad shape. Dalits have not been appeased. Any study of evidence shows the greatest development deficits for these communities. But yes, communalism has not been confronted consistently across religious identities. Nehru said something which I think that majority communalism is even more dangerous than minority separate communalism. It's a difficult, we can debate the question. He said that minority communalism can lead to separatism, but majority communalism leads to fascism. And the dangers of fascism we must recognize.
So coming back to fascism, I want to go back to your earlier comparison with Nazi Germany. Mm-hmm. So during the 1930s, when Hitler was, his party was a majority, he was openly vocal about his hatred for Jews, and there was no hiding around it. But when we look at India right now, we don't see that at the prime minister level, right? The prime minister on multiple occasions publicly condemns communalism and casteism. In speeches, he has several times emphasized unity and diversity for India. So do you think we are at that stage, or is it fair to draw those parallels? Because, I mean, people in the world have called out Holocaust many times, and these have ended up being false alarms. It was a very extreme thing for the world, and it's easy to draw parallels because it evokes strong emotions. But do you think it's fair to bring up Holocaust in this context?
I am not at all convinced that our Prime Minister speaks out in support of equal citizenship for India's Muslims. And the word dog whistle is often used. Dog whistles is when you a dog whistle literally is something that you make a whistle which the dog hears and other people cannot hear. I mean, there are often statements that are made at the level of the Prime Minister which are in the nature of dog whistles. And as and when he needs to, when he says, when the protests happened, I can recognize people with their clothes, or they're investing in qabristans or various thing about infiltrators. The description of the period of India's medieval history as a period of slavery, that India has not overcome just 200 years of slavery, but 1200 years of slavery and so on and so forth. And of course, Mr. Modi's speeches in all the years that he was in Gujarat were much less restrained. He was much more open in his articulation of Muslim, anti-Muslim bigotry. But the point is, his union ministers, starting with Amit Shah, are open. The chief minister of UP, the chief minister of Assam, for instance, the speeches that they make are openly hate speeches. The prime minister can be, charged with many things. He's not a weak prime minister. That's not a charge you can make. And people would not be able to get away with the kinds of hate speeches at very high positions. The 1130% rise in VIP hate speech has happened obviously with the consent. I mean, if the prime minister follows on Twitter people who make hate speeches, he's the prime minister of this country. So I think that there is very open support from the leadership, from the prime minister downwards, to hate speech.
Just, there's a related question from Ms. Dhanya Pandey. Let me just narrate it. Though there is the entire debate around whether Hitler was wholly responsible for causing the Holocaust, do you think it would have still happened without his leadership? Was there sufficient anti-Semitism in the German society that it would have happened anyway?
It's a very good question. I believe, my understanding is that it's easy. I mean, when German society tried to understand in the decades that followed, you can imagine how painful it was for, when you started, you had to ask your own father, your own grandfather, what did you do at that time? And families got torn apart. These were really difficult, painful conversations. But I think that the reality of what I'm understanding in Germany, it's easier to say the locus of evil was out there in the personality of Hitler. Hitler would have been nothing if the majority of the German people did not love and adore him and support him in every respect. Gandhi would have been a non-entity if the majority of Indians had not supported him. So it's not important that he said India belongs equally to people of every faith. It was not important that his last fast was to give back with respect the people, the places of faith of Muslim people. It is that the majority of Indians supported him. So I think this is a societal challenge. And if it was not, Hitler became what he had, the power that he had, because there was a strong support within the society for those sentiments.
Do you think the majority of Indian society right now harbors these communal feelings, or is it just a loud minority?
Uh, I'm a person who loves and also hopes deeply that it is still a minority. The problem is it's not an insignificant minority. It's not a fringe. This idea that this is a fringe is a very convenient one, which is, you can allow the dharma sansar to happen, but you're very clear about how they are being treated, how difficult it was to get them prosecuted, how the person is already in on bail and so on, and people who have spoken in defense of the constitution, etc., are locked up in prison and so on. So the differences are very, very clear. Yeah, go ahead. I think we're losing time.
Yeah, just on this way, just a continuation of that. So today we saw a video of a young Muslim girl being heckled by a mob of young men wearing saffron scarves and shouting slogans. Do you think such incidents are orchestrated for political motives, or is this really a reflection of how the contemporary Indian men are, and this is a preview into where our society is headed?
Yeah, I think that it is a mirror of how a section of young people do believe what they believe in. I mean, I think even at our best times, at least it's estimated at least 20% of Indians did believe in an India very different from what the Constitution promised. That is likely to be the case in many parts of the world. The far right is getting about 30% of the vote share in France at this moment, for instance. But I still, the anti-CA protests, for instance, or the farmers' protests really showed a very different India. And to just give you an illustration of young people, for instance, the Prime Minister, when he made a statement that hum kapdon se pehchan lete hain, there was a young lawyer, a young Hindu lawyer in Jabalpur, who got very anguished to hear the Prime Minister say this. So he bought a ticket and came to Delhi, where we were protesting. He came to Jantar Mantar. It was freezing winter. And he came there and he said, I want to reply to the Prime Minister. And what he did was that he stripped down to his boxer shorts. And he put up a poster saying, Ab mere kapdon se Pradhan Mantri aap pehchaniye ki main kaun hu. And of course, it was very cold. And we said, okay, now you've made your point. Now please put on some clothes, etc. He said, nahi, Pradhan Mantri ko mujhe jawab dena padega. And it was only about 9-10 at night so we all took off our warm clothes, dressed him up, etc. But that sense, he was not a Muslim, but he felt that pain. That is what is going to save India. I mean, to my mind, there are enough people when the Gurdwaras opened up and so on. These were moments when you realize that there's something in this land. We have lived, I mean, this is the one civilization in which 8 major religions of the world, grew and were fostered, lived together peacefully. And I think that is the India that will still prevail in the end.
So Tia has been waiting for quite some time for a question, but just on this one thought, do you think it is people understand, and is there any way to make them understand that it doesn't stop at one group? When you see a certain group being targeted for a certain activity and you let it happen because it doesn't affect you, it doesn't stop there. So just today's incident where it seems like it's okay for most Indians that a group of men, dozens and dozens of men together harass one young girl because she's wearing a burqa. But tomorrow it would be because these men don't want a girl to wear a jeans. So it would be towards a girl who's wearing a jeans. And day after it would be towards a girl wearing a lipstick. It doesn't stop. So you could be a target eventually. Is this not, why don't we see more of an outrage from women? Is this not obvious to them? Or have they othered the Muslim woman so much that they just cannot empathize with the Muslim woman anymore?
It's a very thoughtful question. It is when you other the other. You other. I mean, I saw in the minority in Gujarat. Ashish Khaitan is a journalist, very brave journalist who actually did something. He pretended to join the Bajrang Dal groups and stayed 6 months with them. And his recordings, I think, should be compulsory listening, because people spoke about. And I saw this video, for instance, about somebody who the visual actually shows him with his wife, and he's describing with great pride how he raped Muslim women, and his wife is sitting with him and nodding in appreciation. That can only happen if, how can a woman appreciate the rape of another woman by her own husband, that also by her own husband? And then he talks about how he used to pulp them and so on. So it is this business that when we succeed in dehumanizing the other, and that's why fraternity is so important. Fraternity is the other extreme of the idea that you might be completely different from me, you might worship differently, you might eat differently, you might talk a different language, but in the end, we are bound to each other. If I see a homeless child, do I think of my own child? That's my question. We'll have to wind up now, I think. We almost, but yeah, by all means.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that. I have so many takeaways from this conversation. It's interesting that you raised the point about fraternity. It's interesting that you raised the point that it's very important right now for the youth of the country to question what kind of a country we want to grow up in. But I read this very interesting article by one of I think constitutional experts, which talked about why this is happening, right? And they were trying to understand, and what they said was that fundamental values such as secularism are abstract and often difficult to grasp at for the masses. Hate, on the other hand, can be easily weaponized, spread um, through all its oversimplifications. So, do you think that there is, it's time to sort of re-articulate these fundamental values in a manner that is more accessible for everyone to understand and for it to trickle down into the public sphere?
Yeah, a very important question. My belief, actually, and this is based on those 100 days, particularly of the anti-CA protests. Because this was a time when spontaneously, none of us sat and decided that this is going to be the symbol of the protest. People made it the symbol of the protest, was the Constitution. And I still get goosebumps where, I would be addressing a crowd of 1 lakh people in some corner of the country. And it always ended with a girl coming and reading in the local language the words of the preamble, and the crowd repeating it reverentially, after her. There were smaller gatherings, also like Shaheen Bagh type of gatherings, then happened all across the country. And in that was largely working class women, mostly Muslim women in these. I used to spend my time in those meetings talking to them about the Constitution. And I was very reassured by about how much they understood the core of what. I mean, they won't be able to tell you which section says what, etc. But the spirit of the Constitution, the morality of the Constitution, that's why I also said earlier, जब हम कहते हैं हम इंसाफ की बात करते हैं, कौन इंसाफ नहीं समझता, सबके लिए बराबर का इंसाफ होगा. ये कोई आज़ादी became, and when you speak, I realize that हाँ मजहब की आज़ादी सब समझते हैं. And our idea of secularism in India is a very different idea from that in Europe. Ours is not a denial of faith, but equal respect for every faith, including the absence of faith. And I think ordinary Indians understand it better than most of us do. They live that.
Thank you, sir. On that beautiful note, we'll conclude today's conversation. This was the most very enlightening session, and we think your zeal for inclusive India is truly admirable. We wish you all the best in your endeavors. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you to everyone who's watching us.
Thank you, all of you. It was a pleasure to talk. Zindabad.